About 6 years ago, when I was a university student, I lived in a shared flat in a small city. I worked nights at a bar that was about a 30-minute walk from where I lived. Most nights I walked or biked home, even though my shift usually ended sometime after 1 a.m. The route was normally safe. It went through busy areas full of bars and restaurants, so the only problems I usually dealt with were drunk people yelling in the streets or strangers trying to convince me to join them for another drink. One night, while walking home after work, I passed a group of 6 or 7 guys coming the opposite direction. As they got closer, they started shouting things at me and calling me over to drink with them. It was annoying, but not unusual. At first I laughed it off and waved them away, but they kept yelling and their tone quickly became more aggressive. Irritated, I flipped them off and told them to leave me alone before continuing down the street. A few minutes later, I stopped briefly to fix my shoelace. When I looked back, my stomach dropped. The same group of guys had turned around and were now walking behind me. What made it worse was that they were completely silent this time. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they had just changed direction. Still, something felt wrong. They had clearly turned away from the bars and were now following the same route I was taking home. I started walking faster. While walking, I called my roommate to see if she was home. Unfortunately, she didn't answer. When I reached the street where my building was, I quickly turned off the main road and began running, hoping to get inside before they saw exactly where I lived. I made it through the front entrance and into my flat. Relieved, I grabbed a drink from the kitchen and tried to calm down while texting my roommate about the strange guys who had followed me. Then I walked into the living room and nearly froze. Through the large front window, I could see them standing in the small garden outside my building. They were pointing toward the window, waving and laughing. I immediately stepped back into the hallway so they couldn't see me. Seconds later, loud banging started on the glass. They were shouting and laughing outside, clearly enjoying themselves. This went on for several minutes while I debated whether I should call the police. Then the noise suddenly stopped. When I cautiously looked back toward the window, one of the guys was standing right against the glass, yelling disgusting things and trying to provoke me into coming outside. At that moment, I realized something even worse. Not all of them were outside anymore. A loud crash echoed through the building. The main entrance door downstairs had never locked properly, and it sounded like they had forced their way inside. Moments later, heavy pounding started on my flat's front door. My cat began hissing and screeching, and I felt completely trapped. Panicking, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find in the kitchen, a frying pan, and stood in the hallway staring at the door while I called the police. The pounding kept getting louder, and I could hear the wood starting to crack. Then, just a few minutes later, flashing lights appeared outside. The moment the police cars pulled up, the noise stopped. Through the window, I saw the men scatter and run into the night. When the officers checked the door, they said the frame had already started splintering. If they had arrived much later, the door probably would have given way. As far as I know, those men were never identified. Even now, I try not to think about what might have happened if the police had taken just a little longer to arrive. This happened when I was a kid, growing up on a small island town off the coast of Washington State. It was considered a very safe place, especially because it was a military community. One evening, my friends and I were outside riding our bikes and playing in the street before dinner. It was the kind of quiet neighborhood where kids spent hours outside without worrying about much. While we were playing, a car slowly pulled up and stopped near us. The driver rolled down his window and called me over. I walked closer, thinking maybe he needed directions. There was also a woman sitting in the passenger seat, which made the situation seem normal at the time. The man asked if I had seen any kids wandering around because he said his children were missing. I told him I hadn't seen anyone like that, but there was a park just around the corner where kids usually played. That's when he asked if I would get in the car and show them where the park was. Even as a kid, something about that felt wrong. I told him no. He asked again, more politely this time, saying it would really help them find their kids. Again, I refused. Instead, I simply gave him directions to the park and walked back toward my friends. A few seconds later, the car drove away. Later that evening, when my mom called me inside for dinner, I proudly told her how I had helped someone find the park. Her expression immediately changed. She tried to stay calm, but I could tell she was worried. When my dad got home later and heard the story, his reaction was much more serious. He told me he was glad I wanted to help people, but he explained something I would never forget. Adults should never ask children for help like that. If an adult truly needs assistance, they should ask another adult. He told me I had been lucky and that things could have ended very differently if I had gotten into that car. At the time, I felt embarrassed and a little upset that he sounded so strict. But now, years later, I understand he was scared. And his warning is some winter night when I was a teenager. My mom and I were alone in our house in Missouri. My dad was away on a work trip, which almost never happened, so the house felt strangely quiet. Our home had 3 levels. The basement was finished and basically became my hangout spot. I spent most of my time down there playing games or watching movies, only going upstairs to sleep. That night, I convinced my mom to watch a horror movie with me in the basement. She hated scary movies, but I thought it would be funny to see how long she could last before making me turn it off. About halfway through the movie, I thought I heard something upstairs. At first, I ignored it. The movie was loud, and I figured I was imagining things. But then, I heard it again. Clear footsteps moving around on the floor above us. My dad was out of town, and my mom was sitting next to me. Someone else was in the house. For a few seconds, I just sat there listening. It sounded like more than one person walking around. My stomach dropped when I realized what that meant. I whispered to my mom that we had to leave immediately. Luckily, the basement had a back door that led outside. We quietly slipped out into the cold night and ran toward the side of the house, hiding behind some bushes. It was completely dark outside except for the basement light behind us. I called 911 as quietly as I could, but before I could even finish telling the operator our address, I noticed the light near the basement door suddenly brighten. Someone had opened it. From where we were hiding, I could see several shadows rushing out of the house and sprinting toward the woods behind our property. They moved fast, like they had just realized someone else was there. I counted at least 4 figures, maybe more. They disappeared into the darkness within seconds. When the police arrived shortly after, they searched the house and the area around it. Whoever had broken in was already long gone. To this day, I still think about what might have happened if we had stayed in the basement just a little longer. When I was a young teenager, I lived in a very isolated area near the coast. Our house sat on a hill above an old fishing village that had mostly shut down years earlier. The road leading there was basically a dead end. Aside from a handful of homes, there wasn't much of anything. No stores, no gas stations, not even a motel. Most of the people living there were elderly, and some of the old fishing buildings near the water had been abandoned. During the summer, you might see a few tourists passing through, but from fall to spring, the place was almost completely quiet. One of my daily chores after school was walking up the highway to check our mailbox. It wasn't right beside the house. It was about a 15-minute walk up the road toward the city. Past my home, there were only a few other houses, and after that it turned into thick forest and marshland. The area was almost always covered in fog from the ocean. Some days the mist was so heavy you could barely see a few yards ahead of you. One afternoon, while walking back from the mailbox, I heard a strange rattling sound coming from the road behind me. A vehicle slowly appeared through the fog with its headlights on. It was a dark red minivan moving extremely slowly, maybe 5 miles an hour. That alone was strange because the highway speed limit was around 70. The van rolled to a stop about 10 feet in front of me. Inside was an elderly man with thin gray hair and pale blue eyes that looked watery and tired. He greeted me politely and started making casual conversation, the kind adults sometimes make when they're asking for directions. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I noticed the small white dog sitting in the passenger seat beside him. The dog looked nervous. Every time the man moved his hand while talking, the dog would shrink further back into the seat as if it was afraid of him. Something about that made me uneasy. Another thing that bothered me was that his other hand stayed low between the seats the entire time. I couldn't clearly see what was under it, but something metallic caught the light for a second. After chatting for a minute or two, the man suddenly ended the conversation and slowly drove away toward the city. I shrugged it off and walked home. About a week later, I heard the same rattling engine coming down the road again while I was heading toward the mailbox. The moment I realized it might be the same van, I stepped down into the roadside ditch and crouched in the bushes until it passed. Through the branches, I watched the red minivan crawl along the road while the driver looked around carefully, almost like he was searching for something. Once it was gone, I finished walking to the mailbox. But on my way back, along a long stretch of road with no houses nearby, I saw the van again. This time it was coming toward me much faster. Before I could hide, it pulled up beside me. The old man smiled and said something that immediately made my heart sink. He asked why I had been hiding in the ditch earlier. I tried to play it off, saying I thought I had seen a cat. His smile widened. Then he said I should get into the back seat and play with his puppy. He even offered to drive me home. When I refused and started walking away, his hand suddenly reached out of the window and grabbed my arm. He insisted again. And then he said something that froze me in place. He mentioned my home address. I had never told him where I lived. I yanked my arm free and ran. Behind me, I heard the van's engine rev as he tried backing up to follow me. I sprinted down the road as fast as I could and didn't look back until I reached my aunt's house a few houses away from mine. I pounded on her door until she let me inside. From there, I called my mom to come get me. The police were notified, but since we didn't have a license plate number at the time, there wasn't much they could do. After that, I wasn't allowed to walk alone anymore. But the strange part was that the red minivan kept appearing in the neighborhood. Several times a week, it would slowly drive past right around the time my school bus dropped me off. One day, a neighbor finally confronted the driver and asked him what he was doing there. The old man calmly replied that he had seen a woman working in a garden nearby and had fallen in love with her. When my neighbor pointed out that the woman was married, the man just laughed and said that love required persistence. Then he drove away. My neighbor managed to write down the license plate and called the police. Officers came to the area soon after, but the van had already disappeared again. When they ran the plate number, they discovered something even more unsettling. The red minivan had been reported stolen months earlier. No one in the neighborhood ever saw the old man again after that. But for a long time, every time I walked that foggy road, I couldn't help thinking about how close I might have come to getting into that van.